Would you pray with me? God, we come to you this morning with open hearts and open ears to hear whatever it is you have for us this morning. Would you be with us? Would you really allow us to listen for whatever word you have? And Lord, would you speak through me this morning? May my words not get in the way of yours. Amen. We need each other deeper than anyone ever dares to admit to themselves. These words were said by Patch Adams, if you're familiar with him. In a recent study published by the Surgeon General in 2023, we are told that the lack of social connection poses a significant risk for individual health and longevity. Loneliness and social isolation increase the risk for premature death by 26 and 29%, respectively. In fact, we're told that lacking social connection can increase the risk of premature death as much as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And a 2022 study found that when people were asked how close they felt to others emotionally, only 39% of adults in the US said that they felt connected to others. It's probably no surprise to many of us that recent surveys have found that approximately half of US adults are experiencing loneliness, with some of the highest rates among young adults. It's become one of the major health issues of our days. And it appears that Americans are becoming less socially connected in an age where we seem to always be connected. And while there are many contributing factors to this, one such factor of this disconnection that we're experiencing is the fraying of the social fabric of our society and the trust that we have in each other. In fact, in 1972, 45% of Americans felt they could reliably trust other Americans, but this has shrank to 30%. That was in 2016. I want to know what it is now. And it seems that in addition to this, engagement and community is declining, where now only 16% of Americans feel very attached to their local community. And what we're learning from so many different disciplines within science and psychology and so much more is that social connection is a significant predictor of longevity, better physical, cognitive, and mental health. And in fact, those health outcomes go beyond that. They actually influence an individual's educational attainment, workplace satisfaction, economic prosperity, and overall feelings of well-being and life fulfillment. Now, you might be wondering right now, am I in church, or isn't Pastor Alicia supposed to be preaching this morning on the creation text? Am I in the right place? Yes. My point by giving all of these statistics to you is to the point that it's almost like we were made for each other spiritually, emotionally, and biologically. There's something about humans being together physically in community with other humans that points to how we were made. I remember a time where I have never been more aware of my need for another human and my need for community as when I was climbing a mountain in Glacier National Park last year. I think that's a weird place for it, but I found some of the most incredible community there. And I remember Courtney and I had taken a trip together, just the two of us, without our children, and we were on a particularly hard hike that was about 15 miles, and there's one point of it where it's optional, but we did it. where you have to climb literally 1,000 feet in a mile, which didn't sound that bad to me until I did it. And we had been training for an entire year for this hike. So we were in at least what we thought was peak physical condition for the two of us. And yet, as we start ascending up this mountain, I realized that I was in trouble. And I didn't think I could make it. Literally, it was one of those moments where it was like, do I turn around and go back? Because I don't know that I'm going to be able to make it up this side of this mountain. I had never experienced so much physical difficulty in my life. And in that moment, I had my husband not only encouraging me on, but literally dragging me up a side of, physically pulling me up the side of a mountain, holding on to me, because there were points where there's not really a path. It's just like, go up here, where you're like scaling along rocks, right? And I was like, I'm gonna fall off the side of this mountain. I don't know if I'm gonna make it. And yet, I wouldn't have made it if it had not been for my partner that I had with me. But there was another part of this experience that reminded me of the importance of community. And that was that just as there were a whole bunch of us trying to scale up the side of this mountain, huffing and puffing, breathing harder than we've ever breathed before. There was unfortunately, one woman I remember crying because of the height and how scared she was in this group that was kind of going alongside us as well. We were struggling. And yet, there were also those who had already made it to the top, who were now coming down. And these were complete strangers. And yet every single person who came down that mountain saw us struggling, crying, breathing hard, taking a break, having our partner literally pull us up the side of a mountain. And each person said to us on the way down, keep going. You've got this. It's worth it. Wait till you see the view at the top. And I remember how there was one point in particular, we were about 2/3 of the way up, and I was like, I'm done. Like, I'm not going anymore. Let's turn around. I can't do this. And there was one hiker in particular, I think he just saw me and was like, this woman's struggling. And he looked me right in the eyes, and he was like, keep going. You've got this. It's worth it. And I just remember something about his words revived me and gave me an energy that I finally was like, all right, you know what? I'm gonna do this. And we did. We made it to the top. It was one of the most incredible, spectacular views I've ever seen in my life. We were standing right on the Continental Divide, overlooking an ancient glacier. It was incredible. But I was reminded in that moment of how much we need each other, how much we need community to help us to keep going. And I think that our text today affirms at the deepest level that humans are made for relationship to the point that we can't survive without it. The very creation of humans by God began with God in relationship with God's self. Old Testament scholar Carmen Imes points out that humanity is birthed in community. Let us, our image, our likeness imply group deliberation. And then in Genesis 2, we see that a man needs a partner in work and worship. And even all the animals in the world were not enough to provide the companionship that humans need. Although I have to admit, at some point I was like, but were dogs around at this point? Because they're pretty great. And so seeing this need, God creates a companion for man. Now, this companion is referred to as Adam's helper, and so much unfortunate mistranslation has twisted this word in a way that has further divided humans and actually stripped women at times of being seen in the image of God. But I think the very word in Hebrew used here for helper And my Hebrew pronunciation's not the best, but Ezer Kenegdo demonstrates how humans were made for each other. It's interesting that this noun is often used in the Old Testament to refer to God when God is being called upon for help in times of desperation. And the creation of woman is the only time in the Bible that the word really isn't used about God. We see throughout the Psalms this word being used. Psalm 115, trust in the Lord. He is their helper, Ezer, and shield. Psalm 70, but as for me, I am poor and needy. Come quickly to me, O God. You are my help, my Ezer, and my deliverer. You see, help doesn't mean assist in this sense, but to save and deliver and rescue, to literally bring military aid, to provide, to be trusted, to be blessed because of that help. You see, to call woman a helper is to express that woman is a help and a strength who rescues or saves this man because this man could not serve without her. This person on their own was only half the story and needed a partner. Now, the second half of this word, kenegdo, means in front of or in the presence of. That is working hand in hand, not following behind. And so I think this partner that was created for the first human being called a helper, and Ezer Kenegdo tells us that humans were created for partnership, to work together in community, mutually submitting to one another. And I think that Carmen Imes brings a helpful nuance to this seemingly dualistic understanding of humanity that's also presented in Genesis 2. And she says that phrase, male and female, is parallel to image of God. And that highlights the inclusivity of human status as God's image rather than the particular content of the image. You see, the text does not say God created the male and female so they could be his image, in which case our biological sex would be a necessary aspect of our ability to function as God's image. Rather, the text insists that the image extends to all humans, regardless of sex embodiment. And the point being that our sex, our gender, our marital status, our parental status are not essential components in our identity as God's image. I think this is important as we consider what it means to be made for each other. Because the image of God, I believe, is our answer to how we are to be in relationship. And too often, this passage has been used to exclude those that don't fit into some type of gender binary or those who love someone of the same gender. And it's clear that it is not the sex or gender, marital status or sexual preference, or even parental status of two humans that make them the image of God, but that what images God are these two humans in relationship, that it is the relationship together, humans as a whole, with each other and God to do the work of God that images their creator. So, we are made for each other, and yet, as I pointed out, we are living in perhaps the loneliest time in human history. What might be the answer for us? I think it starts by recognizing the image of God in each other. So much of what divides us happens because we fail to recognize the image of God in another person. And when we do that, then it becomes really easy to dehumanize them and other them, to make them something that is not the same as us. And then humans become labeled because of their otherness rather than their status as an image bearer of the divine. We like to label humans, not as image bearers, but by their immigration status or their skin color or their sexual preference or their political affiliation. I myself have heard things like those liberal snowflakes. I think I've been called one once. Or those Trumpers, right? It's so easy to label the other and forget that they too bear the image of God. I, more than anybody, am guilty of this. I learned something on that trip to Glacier National Park that really changed how I looked at other people and looked at the world in general. And I learned about the Kootenai people, who are an indigenous tribe of the Rocky Mountains on whose land Glacier National Park sits. And they believe that human beings were the last of all beings to be created, and so we are the youngest brother in creation. The traditional Kootenai would have this realization in their mind as they walk through life, and they would carry themselves as one who was walking among elders. I wonder what it means to be in community and to see others and the earth as elders who have something to teach us. What if we walked through life seeing others as having something to teach us simply because they are made in the image of God, even if they are entirely different, even if they are unable to see us as the image of God, even if we struggle to see them as the image of God? A lot of you know that in addition to pastoring, I've had the extreme privilege of working and teaching in several of our prisons here in Illinois over the last many years with North Park and with some other educational institutions. But there is one story that I carry with me, and I will for the rest of my life, that I think, as I was reflecting this week on our text, and what does it mean to see the image of God in another human? What does it mean to really seek out this kind of beloved community? And I remember one of my students from very early on, one of my very first few years working in Stateville, his name was Rusty. And he had, at least in my eyes, committed the most egregious of crimes. And because of this, he had been really ostracized from the rest of the incarcerated community, because what he had done, even in the eyes of the other folks incarcerated at Stateville, was so bad that they wouldn't even associate with him. And he was incredibly lonely. His crimes had earned him the label of most hated, and nobody wanted to be associated with him. Remind you, Stateville is a maximum security prison. So folks serving time there have committed some pretty serious crimes. But Rusty was the most hated. And somehow, he became part of this small experimental improv and storytelling cohort that I was trying out for the very first time. It was my very first time doing this. This was when I had gone very early on to Michelle Clifton when she was the head of the program and said, "Hey, I have this weird idea. Can I try it out?" And so I had gathered this small cohort of students, and Rusty became a part of it. And I could tell from the very beginning that there was something different about him because of the way that he was, even in our classroom, separated from everybody else. And as I asked my students to do, I had asked Rusty, along with all of the others, to take a piece of his story and to retell it in what he understood as saying yes and to his story. And so, in front of our entire cohort, he performed a scene that was between him and the mother of one of his victims. Except that he didn't play himself. He played the mother. And something shifted that day in that room in Stateville. Because God broke my heart in that moment and I think the hearts of the rest of the students in our cohort. Because I heard the gospel afresh in that scene. I heard God's yes and for Rusty. See, I really wasn't able to see him through God's eyes. And I had been wrestling with that. How do I lead this man in this cohort that he's a part of when, God, I can't even see him in your image? And yet in that moment, he was able to hear God's yes and for him as well. And the entire dynamic of our cohort shifted that day. And the rest of the men embraced Rusty as part of the community. It was a little miracle happened that day, I swear. The Spirit was tangible. And what Rusty and I and the others found in this little cohort was beloved community, which in my estimation is the true cure for our loneliness epidemic. We found beloved community between men and women, free and incarcerated, black and white, between those who had committed some of the worst crimes and those of us who get to keep our rap sheets private for now. There were so many things that divided us. And it was so difficult for some of us to see each other in the image of God. And yet, there came a point where we were able to look at each other and not see all of these things that divide us, all of these labels, and yet we could see each other for who we really were, who God had created us to be, made in God's image. And we found real and enduring and life-changing community. And a year later, when the pandemic hit, and the prison had done very little to protect people from getting COVID, Rusty caught it fairly early and died. And while I grieve deeply that he died so soon after we all finally got to know him, my heart feels so much comfort that he didn't die alone. He died with a whole community of folks, a community that didn't even exist for him a couple of years earlier, praying for him, eventually grieving him, and all showing up at his funeral. In a world of loneliness, beloved community is the cure, my friends. And beloved community can only happen when we choose to see each and every person as made in the image of God. And so may God's yes and to each of us help us strive to see the image of God in every person and lead us all into that most beloved of community. Amen.